From the Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. Many of you may have heard of something called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's this giant accumulation of trash in the Pacific Ocean that's about twice the size of Texas. Now, according to a study published in the journal Nature last year, most all of this oceanic garbage is plastic, about 1.6 trillion pieces of it. But the Great Pacific Garbage Patch isn't unique. There are actually 5 major garbage patches in the world's oceans, and these garbage patches are just a fraction of the plastic that's been dumped in our seas over the past several decades. All this plastic is taking a grim toll on marine life. Witness the dead sperm whale found in Italy in April with 48 pounds of disposable dishes, plastic shopping bags, and other debris inside it. Nor does the situation seem to be getting much better. Researchers calculate that somewhere around 8 million tons of plastic are added to the oceans every year. And a report from the World Economic Forum warned that at current dumping levels, there may be more plastic than fish in the oceans by the middle of this century. So on this edition of Global Journalist, a look at the problem of plastic pollution in our oceans. How big is the problem? Who's to blame? What might be done? In a few minutes, we'll hear from some people who have been tracking different aspects of this issue. But first, we're joined from Toronto by Leahy. He's an environmental journalist who's written for many outlets, including National Geographic, The Guardian, and the Interpress News Service. Stephen, welcome.
Hi, Jason. Great to be here.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to have you. As we mentioned, there are millions of tons of plastic in our oceans, and more is being added every day. Give us just an overview. What kinds of problems does this cause for the marine environment?
Well, at least 300 different species are either eating plastic or getting tangled up in it. So we're talking about whales, turtles, seabirds, and even small organisms are ingesting plastics or getting tangled up in it. And it's leading to all sorts of problems in terms of changing their behavior to actually starving to death.
Well, I want to come back to this in a minute, but where did all this plastic come from?
Well, it came from us. I mean, we're producing all this plastic, and we're the ones not disposing of it.
And,
believe it or not.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that only about 9% of all plastic ever produced has been recycled. 80% of all plastic since the 1950s has ended up either in a landfill or in the environment.
And, well, how long does it take for this plastic to break down?
Plastic just turns into smaller and smaller bits, so it doesn't really break down. It's always there. So it takes decades, sometimes hundreds of years to get down to smaller and smaller particles. But it doesn't mean it goes away. It just means it's just such a tiny particle you can't see it anymore.
Okay, so a lot of this plastic, it sounds like it's becoming sort of micro pieces of plastic, smaller and smaller particles. And I want to come back to this, but one of the things I wanted to ask you about was sort of like where this recent plastic waste is coming from. I understand that, the amount of plastic generated across the world has grown significantly over the past several decades, especially in developing nations.
Yeah, the biggest producers of plastic are in Southeast Asia, China in particular. So they're manufacturing far more plastic than we are now. And of course, they're using plastics the same way as we are for plastic shopping bags, disposable single-use items, and all sorts of other methods. But they don't have good waste collection systems.
So oftentimes some of this the plastic is ending up in places where it shouldn't be or wasn't intended to go. But let's go back to this issue about microplastics. You mentioned that plastic, it breaks down into smaller and smaller particles. And the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, there was this estimate there's something like 1.6 trillion pieces of plastic in it. A lot of these are quite small. Talk to us about sort of what some of the problems are caused by these very small pieces of plastic, like 5, 6, 10 millimeters in diameter.
Yeah, a lot of different species mistake these bits of plastic for food, and so they eat them. So fish eat them. So pretty well, there's been estimates, 1 out of every 10 fish has bits of plastic in its stomach, and that's an old study. Seabirds also mistake it for food, and they eat as well. So there are many species of seabirds whose bellies are basically full of plastic, and they're flying around with bellies full of plastic that eventually, of course, they can't eat anymore and then end up starving.
And does this microplastic, if it enters the food chain, does it have impacts on human health, or is it just something that passes through people harmlessly?
Well, that's something we don't know a lot about yet. We do know that we do have plastic inside of us. At the moment, the research seems to indicate it doesn't seem to be affecting us, but one thing we don't know yet is how much of these little bits of plastic that we're ingesting, how many toxic chemicals are attached to them, because bits of plastic are like magnets. They attract pesticides and heavy metals. So this is another way we are being exposed to these kinds of dangerous contaminants.
And I understand recently that I think you wrote a piece for National Geographic that talked about this study that showed there are actually microplastics raining down from the sky in places as far away as like the Pyrenees Mountains in France. Talk to us about that.
Yes, it turns out that there's not only plastic in the oceans, there's plastic in our air. So in the remote region of the European mountains, they were finding 300 bits of plastic falling out of the sky for every square yard. It's an astonishing amount of plastic. And the first time that kind of study has ever been done in a remote region. There have been a couple other studies examining plastics in the air in cities, and they have, of course, found similar amounts of plastic in the air. So this is something I think we need to have a lot more research on to find out how much plastic we're being exposed to, as well as wildlife on land.
And I just wanted to move you back to these sort of microplastics, small pieces of plastic in the ocean. You wrote an article several years ago about how they're actually changing the ecology of the oceans. And I think you wrote about this study about invertebrates called sea skates that benefit actually from the little bits of plastic floating around in the ocean. They're able to sort of lay their eggs and make their homes on top of all this plastic. It was sort of changing the dynamic of life in that part of the Pacific. Talk to us about that. Is it quite common that we're seeing changes like that?
Well, we're just beginning to investigate those kinds of changes. So in this case, these little insects normally have a hard time finding a place to lay their eggs in the ocean. They have to wait for a bit of feather or maybe a little chunk of wood. But now that the oceans have all these plastic particles in them, they've got much more opportunities to put their eggs, to lay their eggs. And that means their populations are going to expand dramatically. And what the knock-on effect is going to be in the ocean ecology, well, that's still something we don't know.
Well, Stephen Leahy, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having me.
This is Global Journalist. On today's program, we're talking about a major environmental problem that's largely hidden from many people. That's the problem of plastic pollution in our oceans. For more on this topic, we're going to bring in three other people who follow this issue. Joining us from Plymouth, England, is Claire Austell. She's a marine biogeochemist for the Marine Biological Association. Claire, welcome.
Hello, thanks for having me.
And also with us in Oakland, California, is Kate Melgis. She's a senior ocean plastics campaigner for Greenpeace USA. Kate, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And on the line from Santa Cruz, California, is Gary Griggs. He's a professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Gary, welcome.
Thanks. It's a bit early here, but it's good to be on the program.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Claire Austell, if I could start with you. You've researched some different aspects of this issue, including how the level of plastic in the ocean has changed over time. How did you go about this, and what did you find?
Well, it was actually a chance study. I work with something called the Continuous Plankton Recorder, and we have a historic data set that goes back to the 1930s, particularly focused on the North Atlantic.
So wait a minute, what is this thing, the Continuous Plankton Recorder?
Well, it's basically like a big metal torpedo that's towed off volunteer ships. We use things like container ships and ferries, and it has a silk mesh that rolls on continuously, and it captures the plankton and even bits of microplastic. And those samples are sent back to our lab, and we identify and count all of the plankton. But more recently, we've been doing the same with microplastics. And then this paper that came out last week was looking at the entanglements that we get on the continuous plankton recorder, so the larger pieces of plastic.
Okay, and so basically there's this torpedo-like device that the marine biological. So your lab has been dragging around in the ocean, not just for a few years, but for decades, actually, it sounds like. And so you're able to sort of gather data from it to show how plastic entanglements are increasing then.
Exactly, yes. So originally we focus on the plankton, how the communities are changing, but more recently, as interest has grown around plastics, we've realized this data set can be applied to topics such as plastics as well.
And what were your findings?
So what was interesting is that although we know production's increased and it's likely that plastic pollution in the open oceans has increased, it's very difficult to show that because it's very difficult to get a consistent time series over 50, 60 years. And our data set, because it has remained consistent since the 30s, has demonstrated the increase in plastic entanglements beyond the 90s, where other studies have not yet been able to do that. So what we clearly see is a significant increase in plastic-related entanglements.
And Gary Griggs, if I could bring you in, I know that you're an earth scientist, but I understand that a personal hobby of yours is to collect samples of beach sand from all around the world, and that you've been doing that for decades as well. Talk to us about this and what you see in the sand.
Well, I first started collecting sand on a Fulbright in Greece back in 1974-75, and I realized I almost had to scrape the plastic out of the way to find a sample of sand. So over the years, I've continued to collect sand, sort of the DNA of the beach. And it's interesting because I think we may think of sand as all the same, but if you look around the world, depending on the rocks that are being broken down and where we are, they're quite different. I think I have probably over 300 samples now, and every beach I've ever gone to, whether it's in Iceland or Africa or South America, there's always debris on the beach, and friends from time to time will now send me samples, and a few friends have been to some pretty out-of-the-way places, the Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean, that many are uninhabited, and sending back photographs, the beach is covered with plastic. So it's just made me more aware of the ubiquitous nature of the plastic that's, it floats, so it's spread globally no matter where it's produced. It might have been 100 feet away or 2,000 miles away, but it's everywhere.
Well, Kate Mel, who deserves the biggest share of blame for this pollution? I mean, is it us, the consumers, for using so much of this stuff? Is it governments for failing to keep it out of the oceans? Is it the companies that produce it?
Yeah, our position is that it's the companies that produce it. There is so much plastic, and there's a lot that we can do in our lives to avoid plastic packaging, but it's everywhere. It's really hard to find items that are not wrapped in plastic, and so the responsibility is on these corporations to stop producing so much and to innovate new ways to deliver their good stuff.
And Greenpeace, I think it's running a campaign targeting several specific companies. Who did you choose and why?
Yeah, so we're looking at Nestle, Unilever, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, a couple of other ones, but those are some of the largest consumer good companies in the world, and they produce billions of items of products every day that are wrapped in single-use plastic, and they have the resources to innovate away from it, and they've helped create this problem.
Well, I want to come back to this too, because some of the choices that we make can have an impact on this problem of plastic pollution. But it is a complex problem. But Claire Austell, I want to ask you as well about how big a task it is to sort of remove the plastic from the oceans once it's there. I know there's this Dutch organization called the Ocean Cleanup that is trying to develop a way to remove a lot of the plastic from the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. I mean, are some of these technologies promising?
I think they're very promising. I think it's very difficult, as Stephen pointed out. Plastics are breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces. So actually, to remove all of the plastics in the world's oceans, I think is almost impossible. But I do think collecting up some of the larger, more likely to entangle items that are more likely to impact marine mammals and seabirds and some of the other species that are around on our planet would be a good point to start at, and that's kind of where I hope to see some of this work is being used.
Well, Gary Griggs, how do you see things? I mean, is there a technological innovation that is going to help us out of this problem?
With all due respect, I think the scope of the problem is so vast that ever trying to clean up what's in the ocean today is an impossible task. And I don't think personally that's where our resources should be going. It's sort of like trying to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. You know, there's 335 million cubic miles of seawater, and if it was a big pile of plastic water bottles out there that we could go out and scoop up. When we think of something twice the size of Texas or the size of France, it seems to keep growing. And in fact, it's not just the North Pacific, but each of the oceans, we found similar aggregations of plastic. It's just an impossible task, particularly because much of it is now broken down to very small pieces, and much of it is well below the surface. So this effort by the Dutch group, you know, with all good intentions, it was very expensive, and the equipment sort of broke down on their first test run. NOAA did a study a couple of years ago and found out that to try to clean up the Pacific garbage patch, they figured an area about 385,000 square miles, about the size of California, Oregon, and Nevada. It would take 67 ships working for a year if they each took a 650-foot wide swath, and it would cost somewhere just for the ship time between 125 and 500 million dollars, and they're all burning fossil fuels. So I would say we got to stop it at the source. It's the only way we're ever really going to make any impact.
Well, Kate Melgis, I want to ask you again about the source. We did try to get some folks from the Plastic Industry Association to come on the program to talk about this issue. We weren't successful. But one point that the industry has made is that, you know, the problem per se isn't that we're producing a lot of plastic. It's that we don't have good systems in place to recycle it, because most plastics are recyclable. What's your response to that?
Yeah, it's not surprising that they would say that. And going back to something that Stephen said earlier, that to date, only 9% of the plastics that have ever been produced have been recycled, which are horrible numbers. And so we know that recycling is not going to solve the problem. There's no market for, or very small market for recycled plastics. And we need to stop plastic pollution at its source. And if you think about if your bathtub was overflowing, you wouldn't immediately run to start mopping and cleaning up the floor. You would run and turn off the faucet. So we need to stop it at its source.
Well, but Kate, plastics are so integrated into our lives today. Like if
Totally.
even you just tried to live a day without plastic, like you'd run into all sorts of problems, just starting with like brushing your teeth, much less everything else you do during the day. So what plastics would be like the easiest to cut out of our daily use?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of like snack food packaging, bottled drinks, some personal care, home care, face wash, soap. And why can't you just use a bar of soap? Why does it need to be in a plastic jug that you pump out? Same with shampoo. There's shampoo bars. There's a lot of technologies and very basic alternatives that are out there that are just not being prioritized within the market.
We're now producing essentially 1 million bags a minute, or 1 million bags a minute are being used, and a number of countries and now states and cities have realized they can ban them, even though they were in opposition to the plastic industry. And all of our shopping markets here now, people just carry in their cloth bags. So there's a place where there's an easy replacement. And they're a tremendous problem in the ocean that everybody recognizes. I think single-use plastic water bottles is another where maybe 1 in 10 is recycled. And the numbers are phenomenal. In the U.S., we empty about 3,250 bottles every second. We spend $200,000 a minute on bottled water. And most people in the U.S. have very, very safe water. So a big part is public education. Another part is just this convenience, or it's so cool to have that little bottle from Fiji. But when people start to realize that even the quality of bottled water is not as good as tap water because of the way it has to be inspected, a lot of it has contaminants in it. 40% is typically filtered tap water. But I think the public doesn't often understand that. So we've got a job to do in education.
A reminder that you're tuned into Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. On today's program, we're talking about the rapidly expanding amount of plastic in our oceans. We're joined by Claire Austell of the Marine Biological Association in the UK, Kate Melgis of Greenpeace, and Gary Griggs of the University of California, Santa Cruz. If you're interested in more Global Journalists, check us out online at globaljournalist.org. There you can find additional coverage of underreported international news and human rights issues, as well as our recent interview with a Georgia artist who's attracted attention to this issue by making sculptures out of plastic debris found on beaches. You can also like us on Facebook, where we live stream, follow us on Twitter, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, or see our videocast on YouTube. And Claire Austell, if I could bring you back into the discussion as well. One of the issues I know, particularly for marine mammals, is plastic debris left by the fishing industry. Talk to us about this problem and what is being done to address this, because I understand that in your research you often come across what's called, I think, ghost nets or ghost lines left behind by fishing boats.
Exactly, yes. I mean, it's difficult because obviously the items that are more likely to entangle on our recorder are things like fishing line and rope and nets. And again, because the recorder kind of occupies the surface waters, those are more likely to entangle things like seals and dolphins and sea turtles. So our kind of data set demonstrated that since the millennium we've actually seen quite a big increase in these types of entanglements. It's not really clear why. I think most of the fishermen that we speak to with our work are really keen to not let this happen and are doing what they can to reduce those kind of impacts. There's been some interesting new kind of technologies now where they're developing these kind of beacons that if they see a large ghost net and they're not able to pull it out, they attach a beacon and then a conservation effort is made to go out and pull it out. So gradually it's been really positive to see the awareness growing and people trying to take action where they can. So I'm just hopeful that these kind of studies which show those hotspots of where the large entanglement areas are will aid some of that conservation effort.
Well, Gary Griggs, if I could turn this back to what you were mentioning earlier, you talked about the spread of plastic bag bans in California. Single-use plastic bags that you would get at supermarkets have been banned. I think New York recently passed a ban. There are several countries around the world, the European Union, the EU Parliament, I believe, has passed a single-use plastic bag ban. How well do these really work? What impact do they really have? Because one point that the plastics industry has made is that, say you in Missouri or Kansas or somewhere in the middle of the country, if you banned plastic straws or plastic bags, that doesn't really have an impact on plastic that goes into our oceans.
Yeah, I think that's an issue. Certainly the coastal states, the coastal cities, the coastal nations are the ones who are having the most immediate impact on the ocean. But I think it's also just the beginning of an education, a public education, and a way of thinking that when we realize microplastics are getting into fish and we're eating the fish, ultimately I think our own health or the health of our children are the things that concern us the most. Maybe people in the Midwest don't think too much about whales and dolphins and entanglement, but I think one of the biggest challenges is, the plastic industry is like any other industry. They're out to make money, and although a lot of numbers are thrown around and they're hard to get, plastic industry is producing about 1 million tons of plastic every day, and every piece that gets in the ocean or in a river or a lake was put there by somebody that didn't, find another way to dispose of it. And as it was mentioned earlier, the plastic recycling industry, which sounded like a great solution, is overloaded now. China isn't taking much more plastic, and so we really have to find substitutes. And I know now when you take food out from a takeout place, they're making disposable or containers that break down. So, chemists are really smart people, so I can't help but think there are ways we can use things that will biodegrade much more effectively than plastic in the long run.
And Kate Melgis, if you could pick up on this idea of conscious consumerism, where sort of the idea that we as consumers can shape this issue based on the choices we make and what we buy, is that really something that can have an impact on a problem as large as this, or is that even going to make a dent in it if everyone went out and started buying paper plates instead of plastic, or bamboo silverware instead of using plastic single-use silverware?
Yeah, it absolutely will. The companies that are producing plastics want to produce items that customers are going to buy. We can vote with our dollars and vote for the things that we value and we want to support. And absolutely, we're seeing companies like Trader Joe's came out with a commitment on plastics where they're going to reduce some of the plastics in their stores. It's a great start, but they did it because their customers are demanding more and they're demanding less plastic in their stores. So we're starting to see, a lot of companies removing plastic straws like McDonald's and Starbucks, even companies like Aramark. And we're seeing that because their customers want it and they know they're seeing the writing on the wall. So the more we can keep it up, the better.
There's an argument that would say that like these sort of individual consumer choices are going to make such a small impact. The problem is so large, it's global, it's very complex. It's kind of like, well, okay, you drive a hybrid car or maybe you buy your power from a renewable source in the US, but if a new coal power plant is built in Vietnam or somewhere else, that sort of negates the impact of you and tens of thousands of other people doing the same thing. So really, this problem needs to be dealt with sort of on a global scale, and these individual efforts aren't going to make much of an impact.
They will make an impact because they are going to put pressure on these companies to stop producing so much plastic. They'll see that customers, and they already are, customers don't want as much single-use plastic. They're seeing problems in the oceans and in their communities, and they want to avoid it as much as they can, and there's not a lot of options. There's only so much we can do with avoiding bottled water and plastic bags and little things in our life, but the bigger things, we have to put pressure on these companies to do that.
Well, Claire Austell, our time is running short, but what kind of research would you like to see being done on this problem in the future? Like, what is it that we don't know about this problem that we probably should?
Well, I think there's some really exciting stuff coming out now where satellites are trying to identify plastics in the global ocean so that we have a better picture. So it's really important to try and validate the satellite data with in situ data so that we can get a better global picture of where these real hotspots for entanglements are. And those are kind of the first steps, I would say, for trying to clean up any kind of imprint and damage. But again, I think it's quite positive that generally the public are aware and doing what they can, where they can. And I just hope it spills out into some of the other lifestyle choices in terms of our emissions and other climate impacts.
And Gary Griggs, I'll give the last word to you. Are you optimistic that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, this is going to be a problem that it looks different than it does today?
I have a lot of optimism for the young people of the world who have the longest to live with it, and they have the sort of the energy and the optimism. I think people or groups like NPR do an incredible education process that opens people's eyes. You have a lot of credibility. And the other is the top levels of government. Those are harder ones because they're often, bowing over to the industries. But at some point, as Kate said, people vote with their pocketbook and make decisions that are going to affect not only politicians, but industry.
Well, we're out of time for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute at the Missouri School of Journalism and KBIA Mid-Missouri Public Radio. Many thanks to Stephen Leahy, Claire Austell, Kate Melgis, and Gary Griggs for joining us. Our assistant producers this week are Gail Fournier, Annie Lay, and Connor O'Halloran. Rosie Belson is supervising producer. Megan Smaltz is visual editor. Aaron Hay is audio engineer. Travis McMillan is director. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. We'll close with the sound of a humpback whale call recorded off Tonga in the Pacific Ocean from the Watkins Marine Mammal Sound Database at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution.